The day was neither stormy nor bright. It was one of those pale afternoons when the sun hides behind a thin sheet of clouds, unwilling to shine yet refusing to disappear. She sat by the window of their small living room, her hands resting in her lap, the skin wrinkled like delicate paper that had been folded and unfolded too many times. Her son stood near the doorway, arms crossed, his eyes restless, refusing to meet hers for long. He had been avoiding this conversation for weeks, letting his wife's words echo louder than his own thoughts. "Ma," he began, his tone flat, rehearsed, "you know I love you, but things are getting difficult." She tilted her head, her soft gray eyes watching him closely, not with suspicion, but with a patient silence. She had heard that word, difficult, all her life. Life had been nothing but difficult, yet she had carried it, without complaint, on shoulders much smaller than his. "You need care," he continued, shifting his weight as though the floor itself made him uneasy. "It's not fair to the kids or to us. You're getting older. We can't manage everything anymore." Each word landed heavy in the room, but he rushed them out, like stones he wanted to throw quickly and get rid of. She lowered her gaze to her hands, fingers trembling ever so slightly, remembering when those same fingers once tied his shoelaces, packed his school lunches, sewed his clothes until her eyes ached in the dim light of kerosene lamps. He cleared his throat. "There's a good place, clean, safe. They'll take care of you. It's a nursing home. You'll have company there. People your age. You won't be lonely." Lonely. The word almost made her smile, though not from amusement. She wondered if he had ever truly understood loneliness, the kind that seeps into bones at night when the child you raised now turns away, too busy to notice the silence in your room. She looked around their home, the walls lined with memories. Photographs in frames, the faint marks of pencil where she once measured his growing height, the worn chair where her husband had sat before leaving this world. Could such memories be packed into a suitcase and left at the doorstep of strangers? She lifted her eyes to him, her voice quiet but steady. "You think I am a burden?" He flinched, the way one flinches when a truth is spoken aloud. His lips parted, then pressed shut again. After a moment he sighed. "It's not like that. It's just we have our own lives. You don't understand the pressure." The words sliced deeper than he intended. She didn't argue. What was there left to say? She had understood pressure long before he was born. She had understood it when she sold her wedding bangles to pay for his school books, when she worked 12-hour shifts with blistered feet so he could wear clean clothes to university, when she went hungry so that he never had to. Her silence unnerved him, and so he filled it with more explanations, none of which softened the truth. She was being moved aside, tucked away, out of sight, like furniture too old to fit in a renovated house. The day of departure arrived faster than she expected. Her suitcase was small. She had packed only a few saris, a shawl, and a photograph of her late husband. She sat in the back seat of her son's car, the leather cold against her back. The road stretched ahead, unfamiliar, each turn taking her farther from the home where she had lived not just years, but entire lifetimes. Her son drove in silence, occasionally glancing at the rearview mirror but never long enough to truly meet her eyes. His wife sat beside him, tapping her phone, her face lit by its glow, detached from the gravity of the moment. Through the window, fields and houses blurred by, yet she felt no urgency to memorize them. She had already carried too many landscapes in her memory. Villages, markets, train stations, kitchens where the smell of lentils filled the air. What was one more departure in a life of endless leaving? When they reached the nursing home, the building stood tall but hollow, its walls painted in colors too bright, as if trying too hard to mask the emptiness within. A nurse greeted them with a practiced smile, her voice polite, professional but distant. Her son unloaded the suitcase, placed it beside her chair, and bent down briefly. "You'll be fine here, Ma. They'll take care of you." She looked at him, long enough for him to feel the weight of her gaze. She did not weep, did not beg, did not curse. She simply placed her hand over his for a brief second, her touch light but lingering, as though sealing something unsaid between them. Then she withdrew it and turned her eyes to the doorway of her new life. As she walked in, the echo of her steps against the sterile floor whispered louder than any words could. She was not a burden. She was a mother. And mothers carry, they do not weigh. But he would not understand that, not yet. There had been a time when her hands were not wrinkled but young, quick. and calloused from endless work. The smell of earth and sweat clung to her skin in those days, when dawn meant rushing to the fields or to small factory jobs, anything that would bring a few coins home. Poverty was a shadow that never loosened its grip, yet she had learned to stretch one loaf of bread into many meals, to turn hunger into patience, and to hide her own empty stomach behind a gentle smile so her child would never suspect. She remembered the nights most vividly, the nights when the world slept, but she remained awake by the dim glow of a lamp. A small boy lay curled on the mat beside her, his chest rising and falling in rhythm, trusting the universe because he trusted her. While he dreamed, she bent over torn clothes, sewing patches upon patches, the needle piercing through cloth until her fingers grew sore and raw. Every stitch carried a silent prayer. That he might never feel ashamed, that he might walk into school with dignity even if his mother's palms bled behind the curtains. Rainy seasons were the hardest. The roof leaked, the floor turned muddy, and the air filled with the heavy scent of dampness. She often woke to the sound of coughing, the small body beside her shivering under a thin blanket. There was no money for doctors, only home remedies whispered from her own mother's lips. She would sit by him all night, pressing warm cloths against his forehead, whispering lullabies to drown out his wheezing breath, holding his tiny fingers as though her grip alone could anchor him to life. She ate little during those weeks, giving him whatever broth she could manage, drinking only water herself. Hunger was a familiar ache, but fear, the fear of losing him, was a wound deeper than any emptiness in her stomach. Years blurred into each other, each one a repetition of toil and sacrifice. She sold the jewelry once given on her wedding day, the gold bangles that had shone brightly against her youthful skin. She handed them over at a pawnshop with steady hands, though her heart trembled. The coin she received fed him for months, bought books with crisp pages and ink that stained his eager fingers. She never told him what she had given up. She only smiled when he came running to her, holding those books like treasures, his eyes glowing with dreams bigger than their small home. Festivals came and went. Neighbors lit lamps and bought sweets, but in her home there was only the smell of lentils and rice, stretched thin but flavored with her laughter so the boy would not notice what was missing. Once, when he asked why their home had fewer lights, she told him gently that their light was brighter within, pointing to his chest. He believed her then, and she believed it too, because love can make even the darkest rooms feel illuminated. There were moments of joy that carried her through, the first time he wrote his name, the day he came home waving a certificate from school, the times he clung to her sorry, whispering that he wanted to be strong like her. Every milestone was hers as much as his, each triumph stitched from threads of her sacrifice. She never thought of it as giving up her life. She thought of it as planting seeds. If her back ached, if her eyes dimmed, if her body withered, what did it matter as long as he grew tall and unburdened? Her husband had passed too early, leaving behind debts and silence. She became both father and mother, her voice stern when discipline was needed, soft when comfort was required. She never let him see the nights she wept into her pillow, the times she wondered how she would pay for another day. Instead, she rose each morning with determination carved into her face, ready to shield him from every storm. She worked in homes, scrubbing floors, cooking meals she would never taste. She washed clothes until her knuckles cracked, yet she never allowed bitterness to touch her heart. Each coin she earned was tucked away for his schooling, his future, his life. When he grew older, she pushed him to study harder than the others. "Books will be your wings," she often told him, even as her own fingers grew rougher with work. She denied herself new clothes, living in the same faded saris year after year, but she bought him pens, notebooks, uniforms. She dreamed of seeing him walk across a stage one day, head held high, his name called with honor. She never said it aloud, but she carried that dream like fire in her chest, a fire that kept her warm when winters bit at her bones. Every scar on her body, every wrinkle that time etched into her face, was proof of a life lived for him. She carried the weight so that he might fly without ever feeling its heaviness. The sacrifices were never counted, never measured. They were simply given again and again like the steady rhythm of breath. And she believed, with every beat of her weary heart, that one day he would remember, that one day he would see not the burden of her old age but the strength of her love. Days inside the nursing home passed like slow-moving shadows. The clock on the wall ticked faithfully, yet time seemed to have no true meaning. Morning arrived with the metallic clatter of breakfast trays, evening came with the faint hum of televisions in distant rooms, and night crept in with silence so heavy it pressed against the chest. What changed truly from one day to the next? Only the depth of the quiet, the length of the waiting. She sat by the window often, her eyes searching the garden below where wheelchairs and walkers moved slowly along paved paths. Faces turned upward to catch the sun, but few spoke. They carried their own silences, each as heavy as hers. The flowers in the garden bloomed brightly, yet even their colors felt muted, as though painted for someone else's joy. She watched them and thought of her courtyard back home, the marigold she once planted, the mango tree that stretched wide enough to shade her entire yard. She thought of her son running barefoot in that yard, his laughter carrying through the summer air, and wondered how it had all become so distant, like a dream that slipped away before morning. Meals were served at long tables where strangers sat side by side, chewing slowly, heads bent over plates. Conversations were sparse, mostly murmurs about medicines, aches, and memories. Sometimes someone would tell a story, repeating the same words day after day, until the tale itself became a kind of background music. She listened, nodding politely, but her mind wandered elsewhere. The food filled her stomach but not her soul. It had no taste compared to the simple meals she once cooked in her own kitchen, where every spice was measured by instinct, every dish flavored with love. Loneliness grew sharpest in the evenings. Families came to visit other residents, voices echoing in the hallways, footsteps rushing with familiarity. Children carried flowers, grandchildren clung to their grandparents' laps. Laughter burst like fireworks in those otherwise muted walls. She smiled at them, though quietly, her own lap empty, her hands resting idly as if waiting for a small hand to slip into them. But her door rarely opened, and when it did, it was usually a nurse bringing medicine or reminding her of bedtime. She waited, always waited. Perhaps he would come today, she told herself. Perhaps tomorrow. Perhaps next week. She folded her clothes neatly, kept her small room tidy, always prepared in case he arrived unexpectedly. She rehearsed what she would say, gentle words, not accusations, hoping he might look at her face and remember the years she had carried him. But the days lengthened, seasons shifted, and his visits remained as scarce as rain in the desert. At night, the emptiness settled deepest. The room darkened and the silence of the corridors grew so complete that even the faintest sound, a creak of the floor, the rustle of sheets, echoed like thunder. She would lie awake, her mind wandering through corridors of memory. She remembered the weight of her son's small body when he fell asleep on her shoulder, the warmth of his breath against her neck, the way he once whispered, "Don't leave me, Ma." She remembered promising she never would. Now irony twisted that promise inside her chest. She had kept her word, yet he had let go first. Sometimes tears came, silent and uninvited, sliding down the lines of her face. She wiped them quickly, ashamed to let even herself see them. Strength had defined her all her life. Weakness felt like betrayal to the woman she had been. But loneliness does not ask permission. It seeps in unannounced, filling every corner until there is no space left to breathe freely. She found herself listening to sounds that were not there. The faint ring of a bicycle bell, the clap of school shoes against pavement, the call of her name from across the yard. Echoes of a past life circled her, teasing her with their vividness. She reached out sometimes instinctively, her fingers curling as though to grasp a small hand, only to clutch empty air. The staff was kind but busy, their smiles professional, their words gentle but practiced. They cared for her body but not for her soul. That was not their fault. It was not in their job description to fill the void of a forgotten mother's heart. They offered pills for pain but none for longing. They adjusted pillows for comfort, but no one could restore the comfort of belonging. Days turned into months. Her body remained, but her spirit felt like a guest in exile, waiting for a summons that never came. She wondered if he ever thought of her, if her face ever crossed his mind during dinners, business meetings, moments with his children. Did he pause, even once, to remember the woman who had stayed awake on stormy nights, guarding his sleep with her prayers? Or had she already been erased like chalk washed away by rain? Loneliness became her constant companion, sitting beside her in every chair, lying next to her in every bed, whispering to her in every silence. Yet even in the hollow of that emptiness, she held onto one fragile thread. The hope that he would return, that one day the door would open and she would see not the man who called her a burden, but the boy who once ran into her arms and believed she was his entire world. There comes a moment when silence no longer feels like patience but like surrender. For weeks she had waited, believing footsteps might one day echo in the corridor, that his shadow might fall across her doorway. Yet the emptiness answered her hopes again and again, and the waiting itself began to gnaw at her spirit. One evening, as the last rays of sunlight faded into the sterile white of the nursing home walls, she realized something had shifted inside her. She could not keep offering love into a void. She would not let her life dissolve quietly into the background of forgotten stories. Her hands trembled as they had for years, but now they trembled with purpose. She found an old notebook, the kind left behind by another resident, half filled with crossword puzzles. She tore out the pages that weren't blank and began to write. The pen scratched slowly across the paper, each word drawn from the well of memory. She wrote about the hunger she had endured so her son would not know it. She wrote about the nights she had spent stitching clothes by candlelight, her vision blurred from fatigue, but her heart steady with love. She wrote about the mango tree in their yard, where she had sat watching him play, her lap ready to hold him when he grew tired. Every memory was carved into sentences that carried both tenderness and ache. She did not soften the truth, but neither did she exaggerate it. She laid it bare unvarnished, so he would one day see her not as a burden but as the foundation upon which he had built his life. Soon the notebook was not enough. She gathered sheets of paper from the nurses, envelopes from the office, and continued writing. Her hands ached from arthritis, but she pressed on, wrapping her fingers with cloth to ease the pain. She began to see the writing not just as a task but as an act of reclamation. Each page gave her voice back, each line reminding her that she had lived a life worth remembering. She thought of him constantly, the boy who had once clung to her sorry, and whispered that he never wanted to let go. She wondered how the boy had grown into a man who measured her worth in inconvenience. Perhaps he had forgotten the details, blinded by the rush of adulthood. So she would remind him. She would hand him the weight of her truth, and whether he chose to carry it or not, it would be his burden to face. Her writing turned into letters addressed to him. Not accusations but confessions of love, confessions of sacrifice, confessions of the nights she had prayed for his safety even when her own health faltered. She wrote of the shame she had swallowed, the dignity she had given up, the dreams she had deferred. And between those lines she wrote of her pride, the pride of watching him succeed, of hearing his name praised by neighbors, of knowing her pain had not been wasted. Yet the pride was always shadowed by the present truth. "You say I am a burden," one letter began. "Then let me remind you of the burdens I carried so you could stand tall. The burden of hunger, the burden of loneliness, the burden of grief when your father left this world, the burden of hope, heavier than all the rest, because it demanded I keep believing in tomorrow when today gave me no reason." The act of writing gave her strength she hadn't felt in years. Her back straightened, her eyes sharpened, her breath deepened with each word. The loneliness did not vanish, but it no longer consumed her. She had found a purpose greater than waiting. She was weaving a legacy that no silence could erase. Other residents noticed her diligence. Some smiled, others asked what she wrote, and she would answer softly, "My life." They nodded, some with curiosity, others with recognition, as though they too wished someone would record their hidden struggles. For the first time since her arrival, she felt less invisible. She carried herself with a quiet fire that the staff could not ignore. When her notebook filled, she tied the pages with thread and placed them carefully inside a small box, one she had kept beneath her bed. Each packet of words felt like a piece of her soul preserved, a burden wrapped not in bitterness but in truth. She began to imagine the day he would open the box, his hands trembling as hers did now, and confront the weight of her life. The turning point was not loud, not dramatic. It came in the stillness of an ordinary evening, when she understood that being forgotten was not the end. She would not vanish into silence. She would leave behind something heavier than absence, something no one could discard. Her story would become his inheritance, and with it, his responsibility. And in that decision she found a strange peace. For the first time in months, she looked at her reflection in the window and did not see only weariness. She saw resilience. She saw a woman who had carried mountains and was still strong enough to carve them into words. She saw not a burden but a force. The box of letters grew heavier with time, though not from paper alone. Each folded sheet carried a lifetime of memories, bound together by the ink of her sacrifice. She touched the bundle often, her fingers lingering on the worn edges as though she could already feel the gravity it would one day lay upon him. It was no ordinary inheritance. It was the weight of truth, the kind that could not be sold or discarded. It was the burden he had unknowingly asked for when he called her one. She prepared it carefully, sealing each envelope with trembling but determined hands. The words within were not curses but mirrors. Mirrors to show him the nights she walked barefoot to fetch medicine, the mornings she stitched clothes until her vision blurred, the years she silenced her hunger to feed him. Mirrors that would not allow him to look away, no matter how much he wished to. Among the letters she placed a photograph. It was an old one, edges yellowed, corners curling. The boy sitting in her lap, his smile wide and unguarded, his arms wrapped around her neck as though she was the entire world. She looked at that photo often before slipping it into the box. She wanted him to remember that once, he had believed she was not a burden but a home. The burden she crafted was not material, yet it was heavier than gold, sharper than debt, deeper than guilt. It was the burden of memory, the kind that clings to the conscience, whispering in quiet moments, stealing peace from sleep. She imagined him opening the letters one by one, perhaps dismissing the first, then the second, until the repetition of love and sacrifice broke through his defenses. Perhaps he would set them aside, only to find the words waiting for him in the quiet of night. Perhaps he would laugh bitterly at her effort. But the laughter would fade when he realized that truth lingers longer than denial. The thought did not bring her satisfaction in the way revenge might. It brought her a sense of balance, as if the scales of love and betrayal were finally tipping toward justice. She was not seeking to wound him, only to remind him. Yet she knew that remembrance itself can cut sharper than a knife, for it leaves no scars on the skin, only on the heart. When the time came, she gave the box to a trusted nurse with simple instructions. "If anything happens to me, make sure he receives this." Her voice was calm, steady, as though she were arranging flowers, not laying down the weight of an entire life. The nurse, touched by the solemnity of her request, promised to keep it safe. From that day on she carried herself differently. The loneliness still lingered, but it no longer hollowed her. She had shaped her grief into something solid, something unignorable. Each step she took, each breath she drew, was accompanied by the knowledge that her silence would not vanish when she did. Her story would outlive her presence, pressing itself onto the conscience of the son who had turned away. She imagined him receiving the box, perhaps reluctantly, perhaps with irritation. She saw his fingers fumbling with the string, his eyes scanning the first page. At first he might read carelessly, dismissing it as sentimentality. But then he would reach the part about her selling her wedding bangles, or the part where she pressed her body against his shivering frame to keep him warm through winter nights. His chest would tighten, his breath catch. He might set the letter aside, only to find himself pulled back to it hours later, compelled to read more. The burden would not be the paper, but the awakening it demanded. To realize that the woman he had cast aside was the same one who had sacrificed every comfort so he could rise. To see her sacrifices not as distant stories but as living truths he carried unknowingly in every success, every comfort, every moment of ease. That realization would sit heavy on his shoulders, heavier than the responsibility of caring for her ever could have been. And perhaps in the solitude of his nights, he would hear her voice in the words, the gentle rhythm of her lullabies hidden between sentences, the warmth of her hands pressed into the ink. He might call her name aloud, but there would be no answer, only silence reminding him of what he had lost. That silence too would be part of the burden. The thought of his awakening gave her strength, not out of cruelty but out of hope. Hope that even if he could not undo the past, he might learn to honor it. Hope that he might teach his own children the lesson she had lived, that parents are not burdens but blessings carved into the fabric of one's existence. This was the burden she chose to leave him, not guilt for guilt's sake, but the weight of remembrance, the responsibility of acknowledgement, the mirror of truth that would follow him wherever he went. It would be heavy, yes, but it would also be necessary. For only when he carried it would he truly understand who she was, and who he had been because of her. Time does not stop for anyone, but in the quiet of her final days, it seemed to slow just enough for reflection. Her body had grown frail, her steps unsteady, yet her spirit felt lighter than it had in years. She had carried her story from silence into words, and those words now rested in the hands of fate. There was nothing more she could add, nothing more she needed to prove. What remained was the certainty that she had lived a life of giving, of enduring, of loving beyond measure. The world around her moved in muted rhythms, the clink of cutlery in the dining hall, the shuffle of slippers in the corridor, the muted conversations of staff going about their routines. But she no longer felt invisible within it. She had left behind something that would speak when she could not, something that would outlast the walls of the nursing home and travel farther than her weary feet ever could. Parents are never burdens. They are the soil from which children grow, the roots that hold firm even when storms bend the branches. Yet in a world that worships speed and convenience, roots are often forgotten, hidden beneath the surface, unacknowledged until the tree begins to wither. She had been called a burden, pushed aside as though her years of sacrifice counted for nothing. But she knew the truth. She had carried her son long before he carried himself. Love had been her language, though it was not always recognized. It came in the form of sleepless nights, worn hands, skipped meals, quiet prayers. It came in sacrifices so ordinary they went unnoticed, yet without them, his life would not have been possible. That was the message she wanted him to face, that what he dismissed as a burden had been the very foundation of his existence. Perhaps he would resist at first. Perhaps he would grow angry, deny the weight of her words, try to bury them beneath excuses. But the truth has a way of settling into the cracks of denial, growing roots in the silence. He would carry her voice in the back of his mind, hear it when he tucked his own children into bed, feel it when their small hands tugged at his sleeve. In those moments he would realize that what he once called a burden was in fact the purest form of love. Her message was not one of bitterness. It was a reminder, a final gift disguised as weight. She wanted him to remember that love is not measured by convenience, that sacrifice is not weakness, and that forgetting the hands that raised you is the heaviest sin a child can carry. She wanted him to see that the real burden was not her presence, but the guilt of neglect, the shadow of unacknowledged love. If her words could teach him anything, let it be this: parents do not seek repayment. They do not give in order to receive. They give because love leaves them no choice. But to dismiss that love, to discard it in the name of comfort, is to deny the very core of one's humanity. She hoped her son would understand, if not now then someday, that honoring a parent is not about obligation but about gratitude, about remembering the invisible sacrifices that shaped every step of his journey. And if he ever wept over her absence, if the weight of regret pressed too heavily on his chest, she did not wish him endless suffering. She wished him awakening. Let the tears water the seeds of compassion. Let the guilt transform into gentleness. Let the burden of memory teach him to walk differently with those still in his care. That was the true purpose of her gift, to remind him that love, even when neglected, can still guide the heart toward redemption. The closing of her life was not marked by bitterness but by a quiet triumph. She had taken the wound of abandonment and turned it into a lesson too sharp to ignore. She had transformed her silence into a voice that would echo long after she was gone. That was her victory and that was her peace. For every child who forgets, there comes a reckoning, not by punishment but by remembrance. And for every parent who suffers in silence, there is hope that their story will one day be heard, carried not as a burden but as a torch. Her torch now burned in the words she left behind, and whether he liked it or not, it was his to carry. Parents are not burdens. They are blessings disguised as sacrifices, love disguised as hardship, light disguised as shadow. The real burden is failing to see it until it is too late. And when the weight of truth finally settles, it is not the parent who becomes heavy. It is the child who must learn to carry what they once ignored. Her message was simple, but it rang louder than any accusation. Remember me not as a burden, but as the reason you stand where you are. And let my love, even in my absence, be the weight that shapes you into someone better.